think we've had a really good set of discussions yesterday, and I really enjoyed the teacher breakout sessions that I attended, and now we're going to keep going on with some presentations to continue to raise issues for us to discuss. The presentations, the Chinese Communist Party's quest for harmony and stability in the midst of rapid change, and the first slide doesn't appear to be there. But what I want to talk about is the system that the Communist Party had set up after it took power in 1949, and then the system that it has been trying to establish since 1979. So the so-called, what I'm calling the revolutionary system, established after the Communist Party took power in 1979, grew out of Leninist organizational principles that the communists, I mentioned yesterday that the Chinese have been on this quest for wealth and power, for rejuvenation, since the middle of the 19th century. And when the Communist Party and I also talked about the May 4th movement and the influence of the establishment of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Comintern on Chinese revolutionaries, and then how this led to the establishment of the Communist Party of China. And the Communist Party of China was organized along the principles of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, established by V.I. Lenin, and which then took control over the country. What are some of the organizational principles of Leninism? One is party leadership. The Communist Party must lead everything. The Communist Party itself is organized hierarchically, with power centralized at the top. The Communist Party has a monopoly on truth. Within the Communist Party, members are subject to iron discipline, that it's this hierarchical system, that lower levels must obey decisions made at the higher levels. There's a principle called democratic centralism, which means at a local level, at the lower levels, or within every level, if there's policies to be discussed, everyone can discuss them democratically. But once a decision has been made, everyone must follow that decision without question. That's iron discipline. And then each lower level must obey decisions made at the higher level. So that's Leninist ideology. In China, you hear about Marxism-Leninism. Leninism is primarily a theory of organization. Lenin built his organization around Marxist principles. So what is Marxist here? The idea that the Communist Party, the people who join the Communist Party, who will be willing to subject themselves to this iron discipline, to leading the country without question, these are the people who have the most advanced consciousness in society. They have studied Marxism. And within China, they not only studied Marxism, but they studied Leninism, Stalinism, and Maoism, which is the Chinese gloss on Marxism and Leninism based on the experience, based on Chinese history and the experience of the Chinese Communist Party. That they have assiduously studied these theories, and they're committed on behalf of the proletariat, because Marxism is a theory about the working class overthrowing capitalism and establishing a new social system. But in China, because China really had virtually no proletariat to speak of, the Communist Party of China was committed not only to liberating the proletariat, but also the masses of people who were poor peasants. So they study theory. They're committed to leading the masses to eliminate what the communists refer to as feudalism, but it's not really like Western feudalism, and capitalism. So it's a negative program of eliminating the old, but also building socialism as a major step to eventual communism, that socialism will last a long period of time under the dictatorship of the proletariat led by the Communist Party. You will eliminate these old bad pathologies, establish a healthy new system where the Communist Party, on behalf of the proletariat and the poor peasants, establishes a new system to liberate everybody and to eventually achieve the end goal of communism. Private ownership is eliminated in favor of state and collective ownership, including land. And that under the Chinese communists, not only did they advocate this state and collective ownership, but also self-reliance, is not being part of the larger global economy, but relying primarily on itself. In the 1950s, with the help of the USSR, a system was built in China along these lines, modeled on the Soviet experience. But there were internal struggles within the Communist Party over how much bureaucracy was needed. Because if you're going to have a state-owned and state-planned economy, it's going to require a gigantic bureaucracy. And Mao Zedong, who, like Joshua Wong, began as a young revolutionary. He was a librarian at Beijing University. We talked about yesterday about Beida, the 1919, the May 4th movement. Mao Zedong did not like the idea of structures. He didn't like the idea of bureaucracy. And what he felt by the 1950s is the Chinese communists were modeling their new society on the Soviet Union. What they had done was to create a new ruling class centered in the bureaucracy. This new ruling class was divorced from the reality of life of most people who were still poor peasants. Mao felt that the Communist Party was stifling the revolutionary potential it was supposed to have liberated. So he felt at two different times he led movements to destroy the system that he had helped build. The first was the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1960, which resulted in mass starvation and economic disarray. And then from 1966 to 1976, the Cultural Revolution. So once again, Mao was leading the Communist Party to shake up the system that it had spent so much time establishing. And this involved purging people that he had worked with since the 1920s in some cases. Now, it's important to realize that neither the Great Leap Forward nor the Cultural Revolution was initiated or led by the masses. These were initiated from the top, mobilized on orders, and led by the top. So much of the system was actually, what system had been set up was wrecked. But the Communist Party was still not willing to yield its efforts at the leadership and control of the system. So why am I talking about this? Because now we'll shift to the post-Mao reforms. 49 to 79, top-down leadership, heavily influenced by Marxist ideology and Leninist organizational ideology. But since 1979, there has been a radical transformation in how the Communist Party sees its role in Chinese society and its relation with the people of China. Some of us are old enough to remember December 1978, and this is a mouthful, the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. This was a transformational, revolutionary meeting. The Central Committee plenum means everybody in the Central Committee gets together. This is the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee. And it's associated with Deng Xiaoping, who actually was still manipulating things behind the scenes. And this is when the Communist Party shifted the focus of its work away from battling over what is socialism and what's the best way to achieve it, to focusing on the four modernizations: agriculture, industry, science, technology, and national defense. One of the key things that they decided to do was to abandon self-reliance, to abandon state control of all aspects of the economy. And the slogan that was developed at this time was open to the outside world and liven the domestic economy. This is a radical shift away from what the Communist Party had been doing since 1949. 对外开放, open, 开放 really implies open up broadly, 对外, to the outside. 180-degree shift away from self-reliance. 高活经济, enliven the domestic economy. Instead of the dead hand of bureaucracy planning everything, the Communist Party should back off and unleash the entrepreneurial energy which had been suppressed of the Chinese people, which had been so demonstrably successful once unleashed in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and among overseas Chinese communities in the rest of the world, especially in Southeast Asia. Deng Xiaoping said, don't spend or waste a lot of time on ideological arguments about what is socialism and the correct way to achieve it. Instead, the Communist Party should focus on rice bowl issues of improving the standard of living and quality of life. Deng said socialism is not about poverty. Socialism is about wealth. If you read Marx, if you read the Communist Manifesto, he talks about socialism grows out of highly advanced, highly productive capitalism. The point is that in capitalism, you have unequal distribution of the fruits of what has been produced. You have unequal ownership of the means of production. But what socialism will do is just transform the ownership system and therefore make the fruits of economic effort, this highly advanced, technologically developed economy, more widely available to the people. So Deng said, we've been misreading socialism all this time. It's not about asceticism and poverty, it's about wealth. It's about an improved standard of living. So the Communist Party, since 1979, remarkably, has backed off from its effort to directly control or lead everything. It has granted space to individuals, families, and groups to manage more of their own affairs. This is remarkable. So for so many years, the Communist Party wanted to guan, to manage, to Lingdao, to lead everything. And suddenly it said, we tried to lead everything. We talk about totalitarianism, though that's not their term. We tried to lead everything. We blew it. We blew it. We didn't improve the standard of living of our people. Plus, the party is in such disarray after the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. We have to step back. We have to win back the support of the people. We talked about the mandate of heaven yesterday. We have to win back the support of the people, and we have to get our own house in order. We have to let people have more control over their own lives. So since 1979, when I was a student in China, beginning in February of 1979, right after the third plenum, right after these reforms began. And this is one reason that I'm generally, even though in spite of what I just said before, a glass half full person as regards China, because I've seen the tremendous transformation based on the fact of the Communist Party backing off and allowing people to have more control over their own lives. It used to be, there was no job market. It was a job assignment, fund-pay system. Now people can choose their own jobs. They can create their own businesses. They can decide where they want to live in the country. Couldn't do that before. Everyone was fixed in place, a real serf-like feudal system. People can go from the countryside into the cities. You can decide who you want to marry. You don't have to have party approval to get married. You can be friends with whomever you want to be friends with. You don't have the Communist Party manipulating social relations the way that they had done for so many years. The cardinal principle, though, is the leadership of the Communist Party. But, and this gets to Tom's points yesterday, I'd hope you don't have copyright on this stuff. What does leadership mean? What does control mean? What does love the party mean? It's vague. It's intentionally vague. I didn't put it in here, but one of the things that Deng talked about was socialism with Chinese characteristics. But he said, let's not battle about what socialism is. We read Marx, okay, we're going to build socialism, but we never really had capitalism first. So first, we're going to develop our economy, the productive forces, but it's not capitalism because that's not our goal. It's the primary stage of socialism. So you can waste a lot of time arguing with Chinese about what's the difference between the primary stage of socialism and capitalism. It just shows you don't understand that this is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So if then you say, well, what are Chinese characteristics? We're Chinese. Say no more, say no more. That's so that they don't want to talk about this kind of stuff. Ideology, you don't talk, unless you're paid to teach Marxism, you don't deal with ideology anymore. So one of the things that's been so remarkable to me is to watch that at first in early 1979, the tentative moves of the party not knowing what its role was anymore in society, party shifting back and then allowing people to capture, to expand social space, to take more control over their own lives. They grabbed it initially very tentatively, but then with unbelievable amount of gusto. And one of the things that's been so surprising to me is to see how the Communist Party has continued to retrench and to tolerate experimentation. Calling China totalitarian is completely misleading. Yes, it's a dictatorship, but it's a very messy dictatorship. In some areas of life, there's still strong control. In other areas, it's wide open. It's open season. So for me, one of the things that is noticeable is that the social changes that have occurred under reform have been more fundamental than the social changes which resulted from the Communist Party's efforts to transform society from the top. That I think China is a much different place now as a result of this evolutionary transformation than what was achieved under Mao when they tried to institute class struggle and to eliminate all these all the pathologies of the previous system. You've got all these new social forces which have emerged. I've done a lot of research on the emergence of private entrepreneurs. When I was a student, there were no private businesses. There was no micro enterprise, which the 1990 Institute is very involved in. There was no there were no markets. There were no farmers markets. Now, so much of the economy is in private hands. There's big private businesses, but also there's just millions, tens of millions of small mom and pop operations. This is a whole new social group which has emerged in China, small and large private entrepreneurs. You've got the emergence of a middle class, however that's defined. But the middle class in many ways is defined by its consumption. And China has become a really aggressively consuming society. You've got internal and international migrants. You've got peasants moving to the cities. You've got 250 million, that's probably an underestimate, people who have left the countryside to go to the cities to work. So when you see all this construction that has gone on, we talked about the high-speed rail and so on. When you go to hotels, when you go to restaurants, when you go to stores, virtually everybody working in there is from somewhere else. But they have not been, it's not the party that has moved them from one place to another. They've been given the space to take the initiative to pursue their own dreams. I mentioned yesterday the China dream. So you've got internal migrants, but you've also got international migrants. You've got tens of thousands of Chinese students in the United States, probably hundreds of thousands, but you've got Chinese students all over the world. You go to Japan, you go to South Korea, you go to Europe, Chinese students everywhere. You've got Chinese business people everywhere. You've got Chinese tourists everywhere. One of the things at Cal that's been so interesting to watch, when I started at Cal in the 80s, every day there would be these tour buses pull up full of Japanese tourists, and they would be filtered into this ASUC store, and they would buy tchotchkes. They would buy Cal tchotchkes. I can't think of the English word. And then they would take them back home. And I think that's what kept the university afloat through most of the 80s. Then later on in the 80s and in the 90s, the Japanese stopped coming, or they would go Stanford, maybe go somewhere else. And then you had all of these buses come, and they would disgorge Taiwanese and South Korean tourists. Now who comes? They're all PRC tourists. Just walking on campus the other day, Chinese student groups, tour group or study group of China. They're coming here to learn English during the summer, which is what the Taiwanese and the Koreans had done in the past. When the horrible, the Asiana flight that crashed, I took that flight actually last week, but when it didn't crash, but when that one that did crash, it was full of Chinese students coming to the United States. That's the cheapest flight from Beijing, Seoul, Beijing, Incheon, San Francisco, coming here to study. This new middle class, and all this. So Chinese have become quite globalized. There's this whole movement on domestically and internationally. You've got the rise of lawyers, and some of them are, of course, in economic mergers and acquisitions and foreign investment and getting money overseas and that sort of thing. But you've also got a new whole cadre of criminal lawyers in China, including the so-called rights protection lawyers, which is something we talked about yesterday. And Joshua Wong mentioned that just in the last couple of weeks, they've arrested they just wiped out this whole law firm, which was specializing in human rights, rights protection, protecting the rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. They're not demanding anything that is not in the Chinese Constitution, but they've been arrested for disrupting social order, as well as for leading a corrupt business. We've got one of the things that we talked about yesterday was the shift from subjects to citizens. China is still a dictatorship, but the empowerment of individuals has been a major transformation since the reforms began. More and more people recognize the rights which are laid out in the Chinese state constitution. The Chinese talk a lot about rule of law. Well, some people take it seriously. It's in the newspapers, it's on the media all the time about the rule of law. Some people are naive enough to think that they can actually use the rule of law, use the Constitution to protect their own rights. Since the reforms began, there have been a lot, I've been talking sort of upbeat stuff, but there have been a lot of pathologies, inequality, corruption, sex trafficking, absence of values beyond greed, environmental degradation. Over the course of the 80s, there have been several popular movements for political rights to match economic freedom. So this is where we get to the difference between economic freedom and political freedom. You have all this economic freedom. Now people are saying, is that all there is? I want political rights. And 1989 is most familiar to us, but there have been plenty of other protests, plenty of other demonstrations where people are addressing quality of life issues. Periodically, the CCP, the Communist Party, tries to reassert control over the situation, but it doesn't know what to do or how to do it. What does control mean? Getting back to this issue of vagueness. One reason that they have botched so much relations with Hong Kong and relations with Taiwan is they just don't know how to deal with the forces that they have unleashed domestically and the transformations that have occurred within Hong Kong and Taiwan. They can no longer just manage Chinese society from the top, especially as discipline within the party has still not been reestablished. Xi Jinping is trying to reestablish this iron discipline, but there apparently has been some success in this, but generally the discipline that is part of Leninism is still not been achieved. So the party talks about stability as the key to further development. But again, the vagueness, what is stability? What is stability? Does stability mean you don't have people demonstrating out on the streets, that everybody is in lockstep supporting something? Or does stability mean that you have space, you have opportunities for people to discuss issues and achieve some sort of consensus? There's also been talk about harmony, which is one of the great ironies of the Chinese Communist Party, because communism is built on class struggle. You read the Communist Manifesto, history is the history of class struggle. Well, under the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao administration, nobody talked about class struggle. They talked about harmony, which poor Mao Zedong, I think every morning they have to roll him back over in his glass coffin because what are they doing to this? It's a Confucian term. Mao hated Confucius. He did everything he could to get rid of, run that by me again, Sandra. Okay. It's about as non-revolutionary and Maoist as you can get. But what is harmony? The CCP is desperate to find a common core of values in the midst of ongoing rapid social structural change and exposure to globalization. They've unleashed all of this stuff, and now they don't know what to do with it. One thing I've talked about, there's been a big crisis of belief. This actually began in the 1980s, but you still have great crisis of belief. There's been a revival of religion, traditional religions, foreign religions like Christianity and Islam, but also what are labeled as cults, such as Falun Gong. You've had the rise, the Communist Party substituting nationalism, because communism itself has become a bankrupt ideology. People are claiming the rights which are in the Constitution. My colleague at Berkeley maybe coined the term rightful resistance. You've got lawyers to advocate on behalf of these people and now they're getting locked up. Yesterday, Mary Kay talked about civil society. The Communist Party is very suspicious of people organizing on their own. Theme that I mentioned yesterday is that Chinese society operates on many levels, and the difference between the official definition of reality and life as it's actually lived. The Communist Party tries to hold this idea of chaos, luan, which prevailed in the Cultural Revolution. It's a way of scaring people. You should listen to what the party says. You shouldn't get involved in all these kinds of activities. But young people like Joshua Wong, who is in Hong Kong, but people of his generation in China, don't know from the Cultural Revolution. They don't know from Luan. To them, it's exciting. Ooh, like some of the students at Berkeley. I show Berkeley in the 60s. Oh, those were the days. So their parents who did participate, like myself, said, no. That was then, this is now. The Communist Party in China is saying, oh, no, if you go out on the street, you get involved in all these kinds of activities, it's going to lead to chaos like the Cultural Revolution. It's ancient history. They talk about Taiwan and Hong Kong. Well, what does democracy mean in Taiwan and Hong Kong? It means economic decline. It means political paralysis, like the United States. George was saying before, is that the model that you want? So my bottom line is that the majority of people don't necessarily want Western-style democracy, necessarily in italics, but they do want more space to manage their own lives. They do want the Communist Party to clean up its own act and enforce its own law. There is no countervailing organized force to the Communist Party. So in sum, the reforms have unleashed a tremendous amount of social structural change in culture, change in belief, which will continue. But it's unclear at this point what direction it's going to go and what the ultimate endpoint, if any, will be of that. So thank you very much. Sorry for going over.